There are a few objects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters that carry as much built-in mystique as the three Egyptian god cards: Slipher the Sky Dragon, Obelisk the Tormentor, and the Winged Dragon of Ra. Long before any of them are actually played in a duel, the show spends enormous effort convincing the audience that these cards are different in kind, not just in degree, from everything else in the game. They're introduced as artifacts rather than mere collectibles, said to have been carved by the pharaoh's own priests 3,000 years ago, guarded by Kaiba's rival Pegasus, and by Kaiba himself, described in hushed, reverent tones by characters who otherwise treat every other rare card as a strategic asset to be traded, stolen, or shown off. And yet, across the many hundreds of episodes that make up the original Duel Monsters series, the god cards are used in remarkably few actual duels. That gap between how important the show insists these cards are and how rarely we actually see them in play is one of the more interesting quirks of the series, and pulling on that thread says a lot about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Builds significance without necessarily building frequency. Part of what makes the god cards feel special from the outset is scarcity, and the show is careful to establish that scarcity mechanically as well as narratively. There are exactly 3 of them. They cannot be duplicated or crafted through any known means, and by the time Battle City rolls around, ownership of all 3 is treated as something close to an ultimate goal. Merrick's entire scheme is built around collecting them. Kaiba is willing to bend or ignore his own tournament's rules to get his hands on Obelisk, and the finale of Battle City is essentially a 3-way struggle over who ends up holding all 3 simultaneously. Compare this to virtually every other powerful card in the series. Blue Eyes White Dragon might be described as rare, but the show eventually reveals that Kaiba owns 4 of them, and other rare or powerful cards circulate through trades, tournament prizes, and card shops. The god cards never do. They exist entirely outside the game's normal economy, which immediately signals to the audience that whatever happens with them will matter more than the normal churn of deck building and dueling that fills most other episodes. The mythological weight attached to the cards reinforces that mechanical scarcity. Each god card is tied directly to the show's central mystery about ancient Egypt and the nameless pharaoh's forgotten past. We eventually learn that each card corresponds to one of 3 priests from Atem's former life, Seto, Kaiba's past incarnation, Kareem, and Shada, and that the cards themselves were instrumental in a very old, very high-stakes ceremonial duel that sealed away a great evil and cost the pharaoh his memories and his name in the process. This backstory means that by the time the god cards actually surface as playable objects in the present-day story, they're not simply overpowered game pieces. They're relics tied to the emotional core of the entire series, physical evidence of a story the audience has been trying to piece together since the first season. Every time a god card appears on screen, the show is implicitly reminding its audience of the larger Egyptian mystery, whether or not that particular episode has anything else to do with it. The rules the show attaches to the god cards do a lot of work as well, because they set the cards apart from ordinary strategy in a way that keeps them feeling untouchable even once they start seeing play. Kaiba's version of Obelisk requires sacrificing 3 monsters just to summon it, an enormous cost in a game where card and tempo advantage usually decide outcomes. Sleefer's attack and defense scale directly with the number of cards in its controller's hand, turning something as mundane as hand size into a live stat bar visible to the audience. Ra requires an elaborate chant and can be summoned directly from the hand by paying life points, and its true most devastating effect, the Phoenix transforming, one attack obliterates everything mode, is depicted as something even its wielder might not fully understand how to use. None of these are simple. This card wins because it's strong mechanics. Each god card has its own idiosyncratic ritual attached to it, and that idiosyncrasy makes every appearance feel like an event rather than a routine play. A duelist doesn't just draw a god card and slot it in. Summoning one is staged as a small ceremony in itself, complete with its own visual flourishes, distinct music cues, and dialogue that treats the card's arrival on the field as something momentous. And yet, for cards built up this much, they spend a surprising amount of the series simply not being played. Slipher sits in Yugi's deck for a long stretch without seeing use in a meaningful duel, largely because the show is reluctant to let its most iconic monster, the dark magician-centered strategies the Yugi Taktem side of the story is built around, get overshadowed by a single overwhelming trump card. Obelisk spends much of its screen time as an object being fought over rather than a card being played, since so much of Kaiba's side of the Battle City arc revolves around him trying to reclaim it from Merrick's control rather than actually dueling with it himself. Ra is arguably used the least of the three in any kind of sustained way, appearing dramatically at key moments, but rarely forming the backbone of an ongoing dueling strategy the way, say, Dark Magician or Blue Eyes does across dozens of episodes. Even during Battle City's climactic duels, where all three cards are finally in play at once, the actual amount of screen time devoted to using them tactically is smaller than one might expect, given how much build-up preceded that moment. They tend to function as finishing moves, dramatic reveals that end a duel in a single decisive stroke, rather than as cards that get integrated into an ongoing back and forth the way most of the show's other key monsters do. This underuse isn't really an oversight, so much as a natural consequence of how overwhelming the cards are by design. A card capable of consistently ending duels the instant it hits the field is, from a storytelling perspective, dangerous to use too often, because it removes the tension that makes a duel worth watching in the first place. Part of what makes Yugi's duels compelling across the series is the back and forth of trap cards, counters, bluffs, and mid-duel reversals. If Sleeper or Obelisk could simply be summoned and left to win the game outright every time, entire episodes worth of tactical maneuvering would become moot. The show seems to intuitively understand this, which is likely why the god cards are so often either held in reserve, countered by some equally dramatic effect, or depicted as difficult to summon and maintain rather than simple win conditions. Even in the duels where they do appear, the story tends to introduce some complication. A rule that limits their effectiveness, a countering strategy from the opponent, an emotional or physical toll on the duelist wielding them, that keeps the duel from simply ending the moment a god card touches the field. That restraint protects the tension of individual duels, but it does mean that cumulatively, the cards get far less screen time relative to their narrative importance than almost anything else in the show. There's also a structural reason the cards appear less than their hype might suggest. They're tied so closely to a small handful of characters, primarily Yugi and Atem, Kaiba, and Merrick, that they simply don't have the same opportunities to appear that a card circulating more widely through the cast would. Cards like Dark Magician or Red Eye's Black Dragon show up across many different duelist strategies over the course of the series, giving them far more cumulative screen time, even if no single appearance is as dramatic as a god card's. The Egyptian gods, by contrast, are locked to exactly 3 people for virtually the entire run of the story, and outside of Battle City's climax, those 3 characters are not dueling constantly with these specific cards in every episode. They're dueling with their normal decks the vast majority of the time, saving the god cards narratively and mechanically for moments when the story needs a dramatic escalation. This scarcity of appearance is, in a sense, the same scarcity that makes them special in the first place, just viewed from a different angle. The very quality that makes each appearance feel important is the same quality that limits how often an appearance can happen at all without cheapening the effect. It's worth noting, too, that the god card's importance isn't measured only by how often they're played, but by how much of the plot orbits around their possession and mythology, even when they're sitting untouched. Merrick's entire villainous arc during Battle City is essentially a quest to collect all 3. Kaiba's motivations throughout much of the same arc are driven by his need to reclaim Obelisk and to prove that ancient Egyptian magic, however much he resists believing in it, is real, and the eventual climax of the series' Egyptian arc revolves around the god card's original purpose in sealing away the great evil that threatens to return in the present day. In other words, the cards function less like recurring gameplay tools and more like MacGuffins whose significance is primarily narrative and symbolic. Their rarity in actual play only reinforces that symbolic weight. Precisely because we don't see them constantly, every appearance carries an outsized charge, a sense that something genuinely consequential is happening rather than another routine turn of the game. This dynamic, objects whose narrative importance vastly outpaces their frequency of actual use, isn't unique to Yu-Gi-Oh!, but the god cards may be one of the clearest examples of it within the franchise. They function almost like a superhero's signature weapon that's saved for the final act of every major storyline rather than a tool used in every fight. Their power lies partly in the game mechanics attached to them, but just as much in the discipline the story shows in not overusing them. Had the God cards appeared in every other episode, they likely would have become just another powerful monster among many, no more mysterious or important feeling than any of the show's other headline cards. Instead, by keeping them rare, difficult to summon, tightly restricted to a handful of characters, and reserved for moments of genuine narrative weight, the show manages to make 3 cards feel like the most important objects in the entire game, despite the fact that, added up across hundreds of episodes, the amount of time actually spent watching them be played is comparatively small. The God card's legacy in the end rests less on how often they were used than on how carefully the show made sure every single use counted.